For 2 years, Winsome Sowell talked to her mother every Sunday, and she never once got a good look at her. The picture was always dark. Almeda sat far back from the camera in a dim room with a scarf over her hair, and her sister Ardith always held the phone and did most of the talking. When Winsome asked her mother to come closer to the light, the call would freeze, then drop. So she'd hang up and play the old cassette to fall asleep. Years back, Almeda had recorded herself singing "His Eye is on the Sparrow" into a little tape machine and mailed it north like a letter you could hear. Winsome had worn that tape down to a whisper. She believed she knew that voice better than anybody living. Then one July morning she drove home to Savannah without calling ahead, and she found a ring light aimed at an empty couch, a tape machine plugged in by the wall, and a bedroom door her own sister would not let her open. Here is the part that matters. For 18 years, Winsome had run the largest Black-owned elder care company in the Southeast. She got rich making sure no old person in Georgia was ever left alone and afraid. And inside her own childhood home, the people she loved had become the very thing she'd spent 18 years fighting to prevent. That cassette is the reason she didn't find out sooner. Winsome had tried to come home before. Every time, Ardith headed her off. Mama's fighting an infection. The doctor says no visitors. Daddy gets agitated when his routine changes. Now's just not a good week. Winsome had built a whole company on reading excuses exactly like those in other people's families, and she'd swallowed them in her own for 2 years because they came from her sister, and sisters don't lie about a dying mother. So she stopped asking permission. She stepped back from the day-to-day at the company, bought a house with a garden and a porch swing, and drove the 4 hours down from Atlanta to move her parents into the softest ending money could buy. In her purse was a folder with both their names printed on a deed. She turned onto the street that raised her, and the first thing she saw was the porch light burning at 10 in the morning in the middle of July, like nobody inside had thought to cut it off in a long time. The house was smaller than her memory of it. The paint on the shutters had blistered and curled. One shutter hung off a single nail. Her mother's roses, the little border of white stones, all of it gone under a mat of dead grass nobody had raked in months. Her mother had kept those roses alive through droughts that killed every other yard on the block, and neighbors used to slow their cars to look. Now the beds were dirt and dead stalks, and a garden glove lay stiff by the steps where somebody had dropped it a season ago and never come back for it. She got out in her good linen, and her heels sank into the soft dirt of the walk. She knocked. Feet crossed the floor fast, too fast, like somebody hurrying to reach the door before she could. It opened the width of a face. Ardith stood in the gap, older and harder than the woman on the Sunday calls, and for a moment neither of them said a word. Then Ardith arranged her mouth into a smile that arrived a beat late. "Winsome, you should have called." She kept the door right where it was. "This isn't a good day." Winsome didn't step back. "I'm not asking for a good day. I came to see Mama." Ardith's smile went flat for half a second before she caught it. She stepped back and let the door swing, but she planted herself in the middle of the doorway, so that coming inside meant going around her body. The smell reached Winsome first. Closed windows, old grease, something medicinal underneath. And beneath that, faint and sweet and wrong, the smell of a house where the air hadn't been let out in a long time. Inside, the front room had shrunk to a few working things and a lot of broken ones. The television sat dark under a bedsheet. On the low shelf by the wall sat the thing that would live in her nightmares now. A cheap tablet in a stand angled at the couch, a ring light on a bent tripod, and beside it her mother's tape machine, plugged in, its record light dark. Winsome stopped in the middle of the room. "Where is she? Where's Mama?" Ardith moved between her sister and the hallway. "She's resting. She's been real weak, Winsome. You can't come in here and stir her up. Then I'll sit with her while she rests. Later. Now." The word came out harder than she meant, and it knocked something loose in the house. From the back, down the dim hall, a man's voice called out. Thin, cracked, but she knew it in her spine before she knew it in her head. "Ardith? Who's at the door?" It was her father. On every Sunday call for 2 years, Ardith had said he was napping or his hearing had gone, or he wouldn't sit for the camera. Winsome had believed that too. She went around her sister. Ardith caught her sleeve. Winsome pulled free without looking and went down the hall toward the voice, past the shut door of the room that had been her parents', to the little back room that used to hold nothing but boxes. Her father was in a chair by the window, and the sight of him took the strength out of her knees. Ephraim Sowell had been a big man. He'd loaded freight at the port for 30 years and come home smelling of salt and diesel and picked her up over his head like she weighed nothing. The man in the chair had shrunk inside his own clothes. His wrists were thin as broom handles. On the little table beside him sat a plate with 2 crackers and nothing else, a jelly jar of water, and a plastic pill box with most of its doors standing open and empty. A thin blanket lay folded on the arm of the chair, ready for a cold that came through these walls even on a summer night. The one window in the room didn't open. This was where they kept him. Her breath caught. Daddy. He turned his head. His eyes found her and filled, and his mouth worked before any sound came. There she is. There's my girl. She went down on her knees and put her arms around him, and it was like holding a bird. She could count his ribs through his shirt. He smelled of unwashed hair, and under it, faint, the rose lotion that had lived in this house her whole life, and she couldn't understand why her father would smell of her mother's lotion. Then she understood that, too. He'd been washing with it. 2 years gone, and he was still reaching for the bottle on her side of the sink, because it was the last thing left in the house that smelled like his wife. You came, he whispered. I told them you'd come home and see for yourself. She pulled back. See what, Daddy? Behind her, Ardith said her name in a warning voice. Ephraim's eyes went past his daughter to his other daughter, and for 1 second the old man's face shut like a door, and he decided not to say the thing. Winsome stood, went back down the hall with Ardith on her heels, and put her hand flat on the door of her parents' bedroom. Ardith's hand came down on top of hers, pressing it into the wood. Don't. The 2 sisters stood with their hands stacked on the door, and Winsome saw the sweat on her sister's upper lip. What is wrong with this house? Where is our mother? You don't get to fly in here after all this time, and... Winsome's voice climbed. 18 years I sent money into this house. I called every Sunday. I talked to her 3 days ago. Open this door. The front screen creaked open behind them. A woman stood in the doorway light with a foil-covered plate in her 2 hands, and when she saw Winsome, her face broke apart in a manner no guilty person can fake, and no innocent one would ever need to. It was Bertus Van from next door. Aunt Bertus, who'd lived across that fence for 50 years, who'd braided Winsome's hair on the porch steps and sung alto beside Almeda in the church choir every Sunday of her childhood. The plate shook in her hands. Oh, Lord, Bertus whispered. Nobody told her. The covered plate slipped from her hands and landed flat with a hard slap, the foil denting but holding, and not one person moved to pick it up. Told me what? It wasn't a question anymore. Some part of Winsome already knew, and her mouth kept moving anyway, trying to hold the ceiling up with words. Bertus. Told me what? Bertus looked at Ardith. Ardith looked at the floor. And Bertus, who'd loved Almeda longer than anybody living, couldn't do it one more day. Baby. Her voice broke clean in half. Your mama's been gone almost 2 years. The word gone wouldn't fit in Winsome's mouth. She heard it like a language she'd spoken as a child and forgotten. Gone where? Gone to the store. Gone to church. Gone. She passed. 2 Octobers back. Her heart at the end. But the sugar took her kidneys first. Bertus was crying now. She's out at Laurel Grove, baby. Near about 2 years. Winsome turned to her sister. Ardith hadn't moved from the bedroom door. You said she was resting. 10 minutes ago you told me she was resting. I have talked to her every Sunday for 2 years. I saw her. I sang with her on her birthday in May. And then her eyes went past Ardith to the front room, to the ring light, the tape machine. She walked in on legs that weren't hers and picked up the tablet. The screen woke to a photograph of her mother, smiling from years ago, and she understood all of it at once. The dark room, the scarf, Almeda sitting far back. The picture freezing the second she asked her mother to come close. Ardith fielding every question. The sugar that had supposedly roughened a voice she could no longer hear clearly anyway. 2 years of 3-minute calls in a dark room, and every single time she pushed for a closer look, the screen went to ice and the line went dead, and she had blamed her own signal. She turned the tablet over in her hands. You used her tapes. When I asked to see her better, you froze the call. Somebody sat on that couch in her housecoat and played my mother for 2 years while I wired money into this house. She looked up. Who? Who was my mother's face? Bertus made a sound like something tearing. Bertus reached for her then, both hands open as though Winsome were falling. Winsome stepped back as if the touch would burn. Winsome didn't remember getting to her car. She remembered Bertus calling her name off the porch, then the engine, then her hands carrying her to Laurel Grove the way hands remember a hymn. The cemetery was old and green, full of live oaks with moss hanging down like gray hair. A groundskeeper pointed her the row when she said her mother's name. The stone was small, cheaper than anything her money could have bought. Almeda Gray Soul, the dates, and under them, in words somebody else had chosen for her eye was on the sparrow. Was, past tense, somebody had chosen it that way, as if the watching had ended the day the heart did. Winsome went down into the wet grass in her good clothes and did not get up for a long time. She had been in a glass conference room in Atlanta the week her mother died, laughing, signing her name, ordering lunch for a table of men, while her mother's heart gave out at the far end of the state. And every month since, her money had come into that house, and somebody had spent it, and every Sunday somebody had put her mother on like a coat and sung to her down a phone line. She thought about all the Sundays, all the times she'd said I love you and heard it back in a voice she believed was only tired and was really just a machine held up to a phone. All the money she'd wired home sure it was turning into food and medicine and a warm house, while her mother was already in the ground and her father was eating crackers in a locked back room. 18 years she had spent at the bedsides of other people's mothers, holding strangers' hands so none of them would go afraid, and she hadn't been at her own mother's. And she'd missed it by being the daughter she thought money let her be, the one who sent enough that she never had to come. She stayed until the light went gold through the oaks. Then the grief in her turned over in its sleep and grew edges, and she drove back to get the truth. All of it. Marnell's truck was in the yard when she got back. Ardith had called him. They were circling the wagons. The three of them were in the front room. Ardith on her feet, Marnell on the dipped end of the couch with his cap in his hands, Bertus against the wall with her arms wrapped around herself. Down the hall, her father's door stood shut. Winsome walked to the shelf and pulled the plug on the tape machine, and its little red eye died. Then she looked at her sister. How much? How much of my money came into this house after she died? Where did it go? Ardith lifted her chin. Somebody had to keep the lights on. Daddy's starving down that hall, and you kept the lights on. Marnell set a fat envelope on the couch beside him. Bank statements he'd brought, and Winsome understood he brought them to hand over, not to hide. It wasn't supposed to go this way, Winnie. Ardith said his name like a slap. He kept going anyway. When Mama passed, nobody planned it. Ardith paid the funeral out of what you'd sent that month, and said we'll tell Winsome after the sale closes. Then the next month Mama's disability check came anyway. And Ardith said if we report it, they'll claw back all of it. And where's that coming from? So it just kept coming, straight into her account. I never signed a thing, Winnie. Never touched a dollar of it. I just looked the other way and let her, for 2 years, and I know that's its own kind of stealing. He set his hand on the envelope. I copied these out of the bank folder she keeps in Mama's old desk. I couldn't carry it anymore. You watched her cash a dead woman's checks for 2 years, and you said nothing. He put his face in his hands. Winsome bent and picked up the plate Bertus had dropped, still lying where it fell, because nobody in that house had thought to move it, the foil dented but whole. Under it was real food, greens and cornbread and a piece of chicken, the supper nobody standing in that front room had thought to carry to the man down the hall. She set it on the shelf without a word. Ardith's voice cut across the room, cold and clear. You want to judge me in your linen? The first year I did every bit of it alone. Changed his sheets at 2 a.m, drove her to dialysis, spent my own savings down to the floor. Not one of you came. Not one of you changed a sheet or sat up through a fever or asked what it was costing me. Something breaks in a person, doing all of that by herself. For one breath, Winsome almost felt it. The exhaustion sitting under the cruelty. The place where a burden turns into a grievance and a grievance turns into permission. Plenty of people break, Ardith. Her voice dropped and lower was worse. They don't cut a sick man down to crackers and pocket the difference. They don't cash the dead for 2 years. You didn't hold this family together. You found a way to get paid twice for letting it fall apart. Ardith had no answer for that. It was Bertus who broke the silence. She reached into the bag at her feet and drew out a folded housecoat, Almeida's, the one worn on the calls, and laid it over the arm of the couch like a body. That's not all of it. Your sister won't tell this part right, because it doesn't help her. Bertus's voice shook. Your mama knew she was dying. Those last 2 weeks she knew, and she made me promise her something, holding my hand. She said, don't let them call my Winsome on a telephone to tell her I'm gone. She'll blame herself she wasn't here and carry it the rest of her life. Wait till she comes home on her own, and let her find out here, where somebody who loves her can hold her when she hears it. That was her dying wish, baby. Told to your face. Held. At home. And every ugly thing that came after grew up out of that one loving thing. Winsome turned on her sister. Mama said to wait until I came home on my own. I tried to come home, Ardith. I tried for 2 years, and you turned me back every single time. Her voice shook, because me walking through that door was the one thing that would have stopped the money. Ardith had nothing to put against that. Winsome's eyes were streaming and she wasn't wiping them. Then why become her, Bertus? For 2 years. The first Sunday after we buried her, that phone rang. You calling like always, saying put mama on. And I had that tape in my hand and I don't know what came over me. I held it up to the phone and let her sing to you. And you cried and said mama sounds good today and God forgive me, I couldn't take it back. She pressed the housecoat flat with one hand. One Sunday became all of them. And how do you tell a woman the truth after you've lied to her face for a year? So I kept sitting on that couch. I put on her housecoat. I let the tape do the singing. And the money. Did you take money too? Bertus held her eyes. That was the thing Winsome would carry the rest of her life. Yes, I did. Your sister cut that man's food to nothing, and I couldn't watch him starve through my own fence, so I fed him off what Ardith slipped me to keep my mouth shut on that phone. I took her money and put it in your daddy's mouth. Her jaw worked, and some of it I kept. I won't stand here and let you make me a saint. I've got the sugar, too, same as your mama. My medicine costs more than my whole check. Some months I bought my own insulin with that money and let myself do it, because if I go down there's nobody left to carry that man his supper. I knew whose money it was, and I took it with my eyes open. Winsome looked at the 2 women who'd lied to her for 2 years and knew they were not the same woman. One did it for money. One did it for a plate of food carried across a yard and a promise made to a dying friend, and had just refused, to Winsome's face, the easy lie that would have made her clean. She should have hated Bertus in that moment. She waited for it to come, the clean and simple hate, and it wouldn't come, and that frightened her worse than anything else in the house. She left them and went down the hall to her father. She pulled a chair close and took his thin hands in both of hers. Daddy, I have to tell you something, and I need you to be strong for me one more time. Mama's gone. She's been gone almost 2 years, and nobody told either one of us, and I am so sorry you had to sit in this house while. His hand turned over in hers and gripped her fingers. Baby, I know. Winsome went still. I've known a long time. Every word landed clear. You think a man doesn't know when his wife of 51 years stops coming to his bed? First they told me she was in the hospital, then down in Macon with her sister. Then they stopped telling me anything and kept me back here. His old eyes were wet, but under the wet was something harder than she'd ever seen in him. I found her funeral program in a drawer. Almeida Grace Sowell. I've had it under my mattress a year and some. You knew. This whole time. And you never let on. What was I going to do, Winnie? He almost smiled. Fall out and die of a broke heart. Leave Ardith running everything. And Bertus out there in your mama's housecoat. And you up in Atlanta with no idea? If I let on I knew, the whole thing comes down. Bertus to jail, maybe. Your sister. My own children. I did the arithmetic. Same as everybody in this house did the arithmetic. His chin shook. So every day when Ardith cracked that door and said, Mama says hi, Daddy, I said, tell her I said hi right back. And I grieved my wife alone in this little room where none of them could see me do it. because I figured if I held still long enough, you'd come home on your own, like your mama swore you would, and you'd set it right. You always did have the fix-it in you." He lifted her hand to his rough cheek. "You're home. You can put it down now. I've been holding it up alone a long, long time." She put her head down on her father's knees in that back room, and the two of them cried for the woman they'd each been protecting the other from missing. She didn't scream at her sister. Out at that grave, she learned that screaming is a thing you do when you have no power, and Winsome Sowell had power. She'd built a company on knowing exactly how this machinery ran. Every check cashed after her mother's stopped breathing was its own count of fraud. A bedbound man on crackers with his medicine. Cut was a case any protective investigator in the state would open before lunch. By morning, she had it laid out clean. 18 years of her own transfers, the funeral home's paperwork dated 2 years back, the deposits of a dead woman's checks, her father's empty pill box. She made her calls. Adult Protective Services for her father, the Social Security fraud line for the checks, and her own attorney in Atlanta, not to promise that the fall would land only on Ardith. No lawyer could promise that. But to make the investigators understand the difference between the woman who ran the scheme for profit and the old neighbor pulled into it carrying plates of food, who barely kept $1 for herself, who kept a starving man alive. Marnell wasn't clean, and he knew it. He'd watched it happen and said nothing for 2 years, and he would carry that the rest of his life. But he'd never signed a check or kept $1, and the statements he'd laid on that couch were the ones that sank his sister. Winsome let the investigators weigh him. She was done deciding who paid for what. She never had the shouting match with Ardith. Ardith's own scheme finished her, the checks she couldn't stop cashing, the debts she couldn't afford to report, the trail she built with her own 2 hands, one greedy month at a time. When the investigator's car pulled to the curb 3 days later, Ardith stood in the doorway she'd guarded for 2 years and found she had no door left to hide behind. Winsome moved her father to the new house inside the week, the one with the garden and the porch swing she'd ordered before she knew a thing. His color came back in the first month, like a plant carried into the light. She hired the same care she'd spent her life selling to strangers, and this time she read the notes herself every night. The doctor said another couple of months in that back room, and they'd have lost him. As it was, he gained 11 pounds by fall and started asking for seconds and complaining about her cooking, which was how she knew he was truly coming back. And in the second week, when Bertus came up to sit with Ephraim so Winsome could work, the old woman put a cassette in her hand. "There's one more you never heard. Your mama made it 2 days before she passed. She made me swear I'd give it to you the day you learned the truth, and not 1 day before. I've carried it in my Bible 2 years. Winsome waited until the house was dark and her father asleep, and she was by herself. She still had the old machine. She pressed the button that lit the little red eye, and her mother's voice came into the room, rougher than the singing tapes, worn down by the dying, but hers. "Winsome, my Winsome, a breath. If you're hearing this, you came home and you know now, and I am so sorry, baby, because I know you're already asking what you could have done. And I'm telling you from where I am now, nothing. There was nothing. It was my time. It was a good, long life, and you gave me the proudest years of it. You did not miss the end. The end was me lying here, so proud of you I could hardly breathe. I asked Bertus to keep me a little while. That was me, not her. I couldn't stand you getting a phone call all by yourself in that big city. So whatever that woman did to keep her promise to me, whatever it cost, whatever mess it made, you lay it at my feet and not at hers. She's been my sister since before you were born. She fed you off her own stove when I was too sick to stand at mine. If she stumbled carrying what I put on her, you pick her back up. That's the last thing your mama is asking of you. Now go on and live, baby. Put me down and go on and live. My eye's been on you since the day you came into this world, and it is on you right now." And then, low and true, 3 lines of the hymn she'd sung on that first tape a lifetime ago. And the tape ran out. Winsome sat in the dark in her new house with her mother's voice hanging in the air, and for the first time in 2 years, she was hearing it for real. In the weeks that followed, the county came for Ardith. No charge was filed against Bertus. Winsome's attorney had laid every plate she'd carried, every insulin receipt, every dollar she'd taken in front of the investigators, and made certain they saw the whole woman and not only the lie. Winsome hadn't pushed for that because it was clean. It wasn't clean. She pushed for it because her mother had asked her to, and because the truth, once she let herself hold all of it at one time, was that Bertus Van had loved Almeda Sowell every single day of those 2 years. Ardith may have loved them once too, back when she was changing sheets at 2 in the morning. But somewhere between the exhaustion and the resentment, she had started loving what their weakness paid her instead. One evening that fall, she brought her father out to the porch and set him down on the swing he'd never gotten to see. Bertus took one side of him, and Winsome took the other. Ephraim pushed them off with one thin foot, back and forth, the chains ticking overhead. And after a while, without deciding to, the old man began to hum. Bertus came in under him on the alto, the same as she had every Sunday of Winsome's childhood, and Winsome shut her eyes and let the 2 old voices carry the hymn her mother had left on a tape a lifetime ago. And for the length of one song, nobody in that family was pretending anything at all. Ardith's money left a trail the law could follow. Bertus's love left something harder to name. She lied to a woman's face every Sunday for 2 years. She took money that wasn't hers, and she kept a starving man alive doing it. So you tell me, does a love like that cancel the lie, or only explain it? Was Bertus a liar, or was she love wearing the wrong coat? Tell me down in the comments. Then send this to somebody you love, tonight, before you close your eyes. And if you believe our old people deserve to be seen and fed and told the truth to their faces, subscribe, because that is the only story we tell here.